Isaac was 5 minutes old, and the temple courtyard was already turning to ash around him. A dark lich unraveled in front of a crowd of screaming priests, its bones cracking apart into gray dust that drifted upward like smoke. The light pouring out of the infant's small fists was white and cold, and it did not flicker once. Guards dropped their spears. A bishop fell to his knees in the dirt, his robes soaked through with something that was not holy water. Nobody in that courtyard understood what they were looking at. A newborn child had just erased a monster that had taken 12 armed exorcists to even wound the week before. None of them knew the truth sitting inside that tiny body. The thing wrapped in swaddling cloth was not a miracle. It was the return of something the Empire's ancestors had spent 100 years trying to bury. To understand how a baby ended up standing over a pile of dead magic in his first hour of life, the story had to go back much further than that morning. It had to go back to a man who spent his entire first life grinding away at nothing. He worked the kind of job that eats a person slowly. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, a manager who never learned his name. He saved money in small stacks and watched it disappear into rent and medicine for a mother who never got better. He was tired in a way that never fully left his bones, even on the rare nights he slept. Somewhere in the middle of all that exhaustion, something reached down and pulled him out of his own world entirely. He woke up in a place with no sky, only a churning gray fog and a throne built out of things that used to be alive. Gods needed a weapon, and they needed a soul without enough left to lose. They picked him. They shoved him into a body built from bone and shadow, and told him he would fight their war and then go home. He fought. He rose from a bottom-tier summon that other soldiers laughed at to a name armies whispered before a battle even started. He earned rank after rank, clawing his way up a ladder that was supposed to be impossible for something like him to climb. By the end, kingdoms feared the mention of his name more than they feared the demons he was sent to kill. Then the war ended, and the gods remembered their promise the same way a debtor remembers an old friend. They didn't. He asked to go home. They laughed at him. When he refused to kneel and beg for a mercy he had already earned twice over, they used a sealing relic to trap what was left of his soul inside his own skeletal frame. He had one move left, and he used it. He detonated himself in the center of their temple, taking a wall of their precious architecture down with him, spiteful to the very last second. That should have been the end of it. Instead, his soul drifted for 100 years through the same gray fog, waiting for something to pull it back into shape. And something did. Fate, or whatever force runs the machinery behind fate, dropped him into a newborn body inside the one family in the Empire built specifically to hunt down monsters exactly like him. They named the baby Isaac. His skin was pale as bleached linen, and by the end of his first hour, his hair had already grown in a shade of near-white platinum that nurses kept touching like it might rub off. His eyes were the deep red of drying blood, a color the older midwives crossed themselves at when they thought no one was looking. He looked delicate, breakable, exactly the kind of baby a corrupt official could quietly get rid of without anyone asking hard questions later. The family into whose care he'd been placed wasn't his by blood. He'd been born inside a temporary custody house, a holding ground for infant candidates the great faith screened before assigning them to permanent noble lines. It was supposed to be a formality, a blessing, a signature, a transfer. It was also, quietly, a marketplace for murder. A caretaker named Sister Voss had been paid 2 years' salary in advance to make sure this particular child never survived his first week. She wasn't unusual. Half the staff in that custody house took bribes from rival houses looking to thin out the field of future saints before the real competition even began. Nobody watched newborns too closely. Nobody asked why a baby's milk bottle tasted faintly bitter, or why the bishop overseeing the intake process insisted on personally handling this one infant's feeding schedule. Bishop Adric Voss, the sister's older brother, ran the intake house like his own private toll booth. He collected bribes from families desperate to remove threats to their bloodline's future glory, and in exchange, he made inconvenient infants quietly disappear from the world before they ever learned to walk. He'd done it 11 times before. He had a system. He had a smile he wore for grieving parents that he'd practiced in a mirror. He had never fed poison to something that used to be a demon king. The soul inside Isaac's small body woke up somewhere around bottle number 3, already annoyed. He didn't remember dying. He remembered warmth, then cold, then the unbearable indignity of being unable to lift his own head. His mind was sharp and fully formed, dropped whole into a body that couldn't even focus its eyes properly yet. He understood language before he could form a single word of it. He understood, with a rising and very familiar anger, that someone was trying to kill him again. The bottle came with a faint metallic bite under the sweetness, a taste his old senses recognized instantly. Wholly forged venom, brewed specifically to burn through a demon's regenerating flesh. Cheap poison for humans. A slow, agonizing death sentence for anything with dark blood in its veins. Sister Voss smiled down at him as she tipped the bottle, murmuring something soft and useless about angels and rest. Isaac drank it. His new body didn't die, it didn't even flinch. Something in the strange architecture of human flesh, layered over a soul built from demon-forged bone, took that poison and did something no one in that room could have predicted. It converted it. Raw toxin twisted into raw fuel, sinking into whatever passed for mana channels in an infant this young, filling him with a low hum of strength he hadn't felt since his old body crumbled to dust in a temple 100 years ago. He didn't cry. He grinned. Sister Voss froze mid-lullaby. By the 7th bottle, the nurses whispered that the child had impossibly rosy cheeks for someone supposedly fighting off a fever they'd invented to explain his feeding schedule. By the 10th, one of the junior staff quietly asked whether they should stop, and was told to shut up and keep pouring. By the 15th bottle, Isaac's small fists were glowing faintly under his blanket, and the temple's ambient wards had started ringing a low alarm nobody bothered checking. He wanted more. Somewhere behind those newborn eyes, a mind that had once commanded armies calculated the exact math of it. Stronger poison, faster charge, a straighter shot back to power. He couldn't speak yet, so he did the only thing his tiny limbs allowed. He swung a fat little arm and cracked the empty bottle straight into Bishop Adric's jaw when the man leaned in to check his pulse. The bishop staggered back, blood running from a split lip, utterly baffled at how a 5-hour-old infant had managed to throw a punch with any force behind it at all. That was the moment the quiet murder plan stopped being quiet. Word spread fast through a building full of gossiping staff. A baby had survived 15 doses of divine poison and put a bishop on the floor doing it. By morning, the story had reached the ears of the reigning emperor's court, twisted into something closer to legend with every retelling. A miracle child, a saint too strong for poison to touch. The truth sitting under that legend was much simpler and much darker. Isaac had figured out, in less than a day of new life, that the very weapon built to destroy him was, in his hands, a battery. The court demanded an inquiry. Nobody wanted to be caught covering up an attempted assassination of a baby the whole capital was suddenly whispering about, so the very officials who'd taken bribes to arrange his death now scrambled to look like they'd never touched the case. Bishop Adric, sensing the wind turning against him, tried the only move he had left. He stood in front of the gathered nobles and inquisitors, robes buttoned high to hide the bruise on his jaw, and swore on his own soul that the child's survival was proof of holy favor, nothing more. Isaac, propped in his crib in front of the entire assembly, reached out one small hand toward the man's chest. He couldn't have explained afterward why he did it. Some instinct from his old life, some memory of hunting down liars on a battlefield, pulled his fingers straight toward the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of the bishop's robe. His fist closed around something cold and carved, and he yanked it free before anyone could stop him. The court fell silent. Nestled in Isaac's tiny fingers was a totem carved from blackened bone, etched with sigils that any trained exorcist in that room recognized on sight. A shadow lich binding charm. Forbidden. Illegal for any ordained official to possess, let alone hide inside a temple meant to protect newborns from exactly that kind of corruption. Bishop Adric's face went the color of old parchment. The inquisitors didn't need much more than that. A bishop caught smuggling a banned demonic totem into a nursery, standing over a child he'd tried repeatedly to poison, was the kind of scandal that ended careers and lives in the same afternoon. Guards seized him on the spot. He shouted about a frame job, about conspiracy, about a baby who couldn't possibly have known what he was pulling out of that robe. Nobody believed him. Nobody was looking closely enough at the child in the crib to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd known exactly what he was doing. The totem, once exposed to open air and the attention of a room full of trained clergy, did not sit quietly. It cracked down the middle with a sound like a snapping bone, and the shadow lich sealed inside it tore free in a boiling column of black smoke. It had been trapped in there for who knew how many years, feeding slowly on whatever scraps of dark energy leaked from the intake house's warded walls, and it had grown into something far larger than the little totem should have contained. The lich rose up over the crowd, easily 9 feet of shifting bone and smoke, and every priest in the room who wasn't already backing toward the door threw up a defensive ward instead. Isaac's mana, still buzzing hot from 15 bottles of converted venom, had nowhere left to go. He didn't think it through the way a grown man might have. He simply reached for it, the same way he used to reach for his own power on some battlefield 100 years gone, and let it out. It came pouring from his small fists in a column of blinding white, and it slammed into the lich before the creature had even finished forming its second arm. The light didn't ask permission from the mana coursing through him. It simply took the raw excess and turned it wholly on the way out. The same conversion trick that had turned poison into fuel doing the same thing now to the overflow, bending dark energy through his body until it came out the other end, looking exactly like divine judgment. The lich screamed once, a sound like grinding stone, and then it came apart in the courtyard exactly the way it had at the very start of this story. Dust drifting upward, guards frozen, a bishop weeping on his knees over a ruined career and a ruined life. The emperor's own advisor, watching from the balcony above, later swore he'd never seen holy light that pure. Nobody there understood that they were looking at converted poison and stolen demonic power dressed up in a color they trusted. Word of the newborn's second miracle in as many days reached the great houses within hours. A child who survived assassination by poison and then purged a forbidden demon from a corrupt official's own robes was not a rumor anyone could quietly dismiss. Every faith wanted him. The Gold House, already embarrassed by one of their own bishops getting caught red-handed, wanted him gone from their records as fast as possible. The Crimson House sent a formal inquiry within the same night, hoping to claim a combat prodigy before anyone else could. It was the Blue House, the Ashua family, exorcists by trade and reputation, who arrived first. They came with an honor guard and a formal writ of adoption already signed, executed Bishop Adric on the spot for his crimes against a child under holy protection, and carried Isaac out of that ruined nursery, wrapped in blue ceremonial cloth. The head of that escort, a broad-shouldered man named Reli, held the baby the entire ride back to the estate and refused to let anyone else so much as adjust the blanket. He kept murmuring, half to himself, about how the boy had survived so much already, how he'd grow up protected, how nothing would ever touch him again under this family's roof. Isaac, staring up at the ceiling of the carriage with newborn eyes that had watched empires rise and fall in another life, said nothing. He couldn't yet. But some small, buried part of the mind behind those crimson eyes noted the warmth in that man's grip and filed it away as something worth keeping around. The rest of the family waiting back at the Ashua estate had no idea what they were bringing home. They thought they'd rescued a miracle. They thought they were raising the future of their entire faith, a pure soul destined to finally erase the memory of the ancient enemy their bloodline had spent 70 years trying to forget. The Ashua estate rose out of the mist like something built by people who took prayer seriously and money more seriously still. Blue banners hung from every tower, each stitched with the sigil of an eye wreathed in chains, the mark of a family whose entire purpose was hunting things that didn't want to be found. Servants lined the courtyard in 2 neat rows, waiting for a first look at the child the whole capital was already calling a miracle. Rely carried him through the gates himself, refusing every offer to hand the bundle off to a nursemaid. He'd made that decision somewhere on the ride home and hadn't budged from it since. Patriarch Eli Ashua stood at the top of the estate steps, arms folded, studying the baby with the same expression he might have given a promising but unproven recruit. He was not a warm man. Decades of burying rivals and outlasting 3 different popes had scraped most of the softness out of him long ago. He believed in results, not miracles, and he said so within the first minute of looking at his newest ward. Poison doesn't kill him. Fine, he said, in a voice that carried without being raised. Then we test what does. Reli's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Nobody argued with Eli on his own steps. What followed over the next several months became something the household staff eventually stopped speaking about out loud, mostly out of secondhand embarrassment on the family's behalf. Eli ordered the child submerged briefly in blessed ice water to test his resilience to cold. He ordered him held near open flame, just close enough to judge his reaction to heat, always with a healer standing by to intervene the instant real danger appeared. It was, by the family's own twisted standards, an act of care. Ashua children had endured worse for 3 generations, and every one of them had grown into something formidable because of it. Isaac endured all of it without complaint, mostly because none of it came close to hurting him the way it was meant to. Ice water felt like a mild inconvenience to a body that used to detonate itself for spite. Flame licking near his skin barely registered as warmth. He cried anyway, because infants were expected to cry, and because giving Eli exactly the reaction the old man wanted seemed like the fastest way to earn a little slack. It worked faster than he expected. Within a season, Eli had stopped ordering new trials altogether, apparently satisfied that whatever this child was, it wasn't fragile. Reli was a different animal entirely. Where Eli tested, Reli doted, and he did it with an intensity that made the rest of the household exchange looks behind his back. He personally oversaw the tailoring of Isaac's first proper outfit, a small blue coat with silver thread along the collar, and when the boy wore it without immediately tearing it apart, Reli had to excuse himself from the room to compose his face. He came back red-eyed and smiling, insisting it was allergies. He told anyone who would listen that this child would grow into the finest holy knight the family had produced in 100 years, and he meant every word of it, unaware that the boy sitting quietly on his knee had, in fact, already been the single greatest threat the family's ancestors had ever faced. Somewhere in that first year, in a gesture the household considered a touching tribute to the family's proud history, someone gifted the infant a set of small carved figurines depicting the ancient battle against the Skeleton King. Toy soldiers with tiny painted spears driven into a grinning skull, a miniature diorama of holy knights standing triumphant over a pile of broken bone. Isaac stared at the little wooden version of his own execution for a long moment before reaching out and knocking the whole display off the shelf. The nursemaid apologized to no one in particular and cleaned up the mess, chalking it up to a baby being clumsy with his hands. Nobody in that room understood they'd just handed a war criminal a diorama of his own death and expected him to enjoy it. The other member of the household who mattered early on was Shuri, Isaac's older cousin by 4 years, a boy who had spent his entire short life being told he was the family's next prodigy and had believed every word of it. Shuri didn't like sharing that title. He made it known, in the petty ways young children make things known, that he considered the new baby an inconvenience at best and a rival at worst. He tested that theory exactly once, sneaking into the nursery to pinch the infant hard enough to leave a mark, hoping to provoke tears that would embarrass the household in front of guests visiting the next morning. Isaac didn't cry. Instead, later that same night, a shape made of shifting shadow slid out from beneath his crib and paid Shuri's room a quiet visit. Nothing dramatic, no screaming, no blood. Just a small, invisible companion pulling the blanket slowly off a sleeping boy's feet every few minutes until sunrise, and a low, wordless growl whispered near his ear whenever he tried to fall back asleep. By breakfast, Shuri had dark circles under his eyes and had developed a sudden, deep respect for staying out of the nursery. Isaac never remembered consciously deciding to summon that shadow companion. It simply came when he needed it, an old and familiar presence from his Skeleton King days. Small enough now to hide in gaps of darkness most people never bothered checking. He thought of it, in the private corners of his own mind, as something closer to an old friend than a weapon. It had followed him through 100 years of nothing. It wasn't about to abandon him now over a change in body. The years passed the way they do in households full of ambition, each one adding a little more shape to the child everyone assumed was destined for greatness, for reasons entirely different from the real one. By the time Isaac was old enough to walk steadily on his own, most of the estate had quietly stopped questioning the strange incidents that seemed to follow him. A servant swore she'd seen his shadow move independent of the sun. A groundskeeper found scorch marks near the stables that nobody could explain. Each report got filed away under the same convenient label the family had settled on early. Divine mystery, best left unexamined. It was Gaul, the family's 5th son, who refused to let it stay unexamined. Gaul had spent most of his adult life watching older siblings inherit titles, land, and influence while he collected leftover scraps and polite condolences. He'd built a quiet, careful alliance with a rival house years earlier, one that promised him real power the day the Ashua succession finally worked in his favor. A miracle baby stepping unexpectedly into the family's spotlight threatened every piece of that plan. He started paying closer attention to Isaac than anyone else in that house ever had, and unlike Eli's blunt physical trials or Reli's blind affection, Gaul's attention came laced with suspicion from the very beginning. He noticed the boy's shadow pooling strangely under lantern light. He noticed Shuri's sudden, unexplained fear of the nursery. He noticed that whenever something inexplicable happened around this child, it always seemed to end in someone else's favor, never Isaac's misfortune. Coincidence built on coincidence eventually stops looking like coincidence to anyone paying close enough attention, and Gaul had nothing left to do with his days but pay attention. He kept his suspicions quiet at first, waiting for something concrete enough to bring to Eli without sounding like a jealous younger son grasping at excuses. He found his opening the same week the estate's oldest tree, a gnarled and sacred thing the family had tended for 70 years, finally showed signs it might not survive another winter. The tree stood at the center of the family's private shrine grounds, its bark blackened and hollow near the roots, its branches bare even in seasons when everything else on the estate bloomed. Elders whispered that it had been dying slowly since the era of the Skeleton King's defeat, poisoned by some lingering trace of demonic corruption that had never fully cleared from the soil. Every healer the family brought in over the decades had failed to save it. Most had quietly recommended cutting it down before it collapsed on its own. Eli refused every time. That tree had stood since before his grandfather's grandfather, and letting it die on his watch felt like admitting the family's strength was fading along with it. Gaul saw an opportunity in the tree's failing health long before anyone else did. If the sacred tree finally gave out, someone would need to be blamed, and a suspicious new child with an unexplained shadow following him around the estate made an unusually convenient scapegoat. He began, quietly and carefully, laying the groundwork for exactly that argument, planting small comments in front of the right servants, timing his visits to the shrine grounds whenever Isaac happened to be nearby. He wanted the tree to die. He wanted it to die loudly, publicly, and with Isaac standing close enough to take the blame. Isaac, for his part, noticed Gaul's growing hostility long before the man worked up the nerve to act on it directly. 100 years spent reading the intentions of soldiers and generals had left him with an instinct for spotting exactly this kind of slow-building resentment, the kind that festers quietly until it finally finds an excuse to strike. He decided, in the private calculations only he had access to, that letting the tree die on schedule would hand Gaul precisely the excuse he was looking for. So one evening, while the rest of the household slept and the shrine grounds sat empty under a thin sliver of moon, Isaac slipped out of his room in bare feet and made his way to the base of that dying tree. He didn't understand yet how much power he actually had access to in this small body. Not fully, but he understood corruption when he felt it, and the soil around those roots reeked of exactly the kind of dark rot his old shadow companion had spent 100 years learning to devour. He called the shadow out, and it slid eagerly into the blackened roots like water finding a crack in stone. What happened over the following hour never made it into any official record, because nobody was awake to witness it happen. The rot didn't vanish all at once. It drained slowly, pulled loose thread by thread into the waiting dark, until the poisoned soil beneath that ancient trunk finally ran clean for the first time in 70 years. By sunrise, the tree's bare branches had sprouted the faintest hint of new green buds along their length, the first sign of life the estate had seen from it in living memory. The household staff who found it first thought they were dreaming. Word reached Eli before he'd even finished dressing for the day, and he walked down to the shrine grounds still half convinced someone was playing a cruel joke on an old man. He wasn't laughing when he arrived. He stood in front of that tree for a long, silent minute, running one weathered hand along a branch that hadn't held a leaf since before his own children were born. Gaul arrived shortly after, hoping to find confirmation of the tree's death, and instead finding proof of a miracle he had absolutely no way to explain away. His plan to use the tree's failure as a weapon crumbled the same morning it should have paid off, and he stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, watching his own carefully built excuse turn to dust in front of him. He looked, for one unguarded second, directly at Isaac. The boy met his gaze without flinching, small and quiet in his blue coat, offering nothing that could be mistaken for guilt or triumph. Just a child, watching adults marvel at something they didn't understand. Gaul understood, in that instant, that he had badly underestimated whatever this child actually was. He didn't yet have proof. He didn't yet have allies willing to act on a hunch, but he filed the memory away carefully, the same way Isaac had once filed away the warmth of Relai's grip on that first carriage ride home, and promised himself he would find the proof eventually. He would spend the next several years trying. Eli, meanwhile, declared the tree's revival a sign of the family's favor with the divine, and made a public show of naming Isaac an honorary caretaker of the shrine grounds, a symbolic title usually reserved for adults who'd proven decades of loyal service. Rely wept openly at the ceremony, insisting once again that it was allergies. Shuri sulked in the back row, arms crossed, already sensing that whatever ground he'd once held as the family's golden child was slipping steadily out from under him. None of them noticed the faint shadow curling briefly around Isaac's ankle before it slipped back into hiding, satisfied with a night's work well done. The years kept moving, and the household's suspicions kept quietly building underneath its celebrations, waiting for the day both would finally collide inside a vault nobody had opened in generations. Gaul's patience finally ran out the season Isaac turned 6. 6 years of watching the household shower affection on a child he was now near certain wasn't what he claimed to be, had worn Gaul's restraint down to nothing. He'd gathered what little he could over those years, whispered testimonies from servants too frightened to speak openly, a groundskeeper's account of scorch marks that healed themselves overnight, small oddities that added up to something but never quite enough to bring before the family council with confidence. He needed a bigger move. He needed Isaac gone from the main estate long enough to search his rooms properly, to find something concrete before anyone else could stop him. He found his excuse in an old family tradition nobody had invoked in 3 generations. The Ashua line kept a second property a half-day's ride from the main estate, a crumbling secondary mansion the family called the Annex, built centuries earlier as a private stronghold before the current estate replaced it. Nobody lived there anymore. The building had been sealed after a string of deaths among the staff assigned to guard it, deaths the family blamed on lingering curses from the era of the Skeleton King's original defeat, and the doors had stayed locked ever since. Tradition held that any Ashua child showing signs of dangerous instability be sent there for a period of isolated reflection, meant to test whether their spirit could withstand the weight of their ancestors' unfinished business. It hadn't been invoked in living memory because no child had ever shown signs unsettling enough to justify it. Gaul stood in front of the family council and argued, calmly and with carefully rehearsed concern, that recent incidents around the estate, incidents he was careful not to name Isaac directly for, suggested a spirit inside their halls that needed testing before it grew unmanageable. He didn't say the boy's name once during the entire address. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood exactly who he meant. Eli listened to the whole argument with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, the same face he wore when weighing whether a recruit deserved another chance or a quiet dismissal. When Gaul finished, the old man was silent for a long moment. "He's 6, Rely said, standing so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "You want to send a 6-year-old to a haunted ruin because of rumors?" "I want to test whether the rumors have weight," Gaul said. "If they don't, he comes home in a week with nothing to show for it but a story." Eli's decision, when it finally came, surprised everyone in the room except perhaps himself. He agreed to the exile, not because he believed Gaul's suspicions, but because a family that valued results above comfort couldn't afford to look weak by refusing its own traditions out of sentiment. If Isaac truly carried something dangerous inside him, better to find out now, quietly, on family land, than to have the papal houses discover it first. Rely argued until his voice went hoarse. It didn't change the outcome. Isaac was to spend 1 month at the Annex, alone but for a single assigned attendant, under the guise of ancestral reflection. Isaac took the news with far more calm than a 6-year-old should have managed, which did nothing to ease anyone's suspicions and everything to confirm them in Gaul's mind. He didn't protest. He didn't cry the way Rely half expected him to. He simply nodded, packed a small bag of his own belongings without help, and told his uncle, in a voice steady enough to sound almost reassuring, that he'd be fine. He wasn't lying. He'd been waiting years for an excuse to get inside that building. He'd noticed, long before Gaul ever raised the subject in council, the faint pull of old power radiating from beyond the Annex's sealed gates whenever the wind shifted the right direction. Something old sat locked inside that ruin, something that hummed with the specific, unmistakable weight of a mana signature he recognized on some deep, bone-level part of himself. He'd suspected for a while that a piece of his old fortune, hoarded and forgotten by generations of Ashua ancestors too frightened to touch it, might be sitting somewhere behind those walls. Gaul had just handed him the key on a silver platter. The Annex looked worse up close than it had from a distance. Ivy choked the outer walls, and half the windows had long since caved in, leaving jagged black holes staring out over an overgrown courtyard. The single attendant assigned to accompany him, an older servant named Kobin, who'd clearly drawn the short straw, insisted on lighting every lantern they carried the moment they stepped past the gate, muttering prayers under his breath the whole way in. Isaac let him keep muttering. It gave him cover to explore. He found Shuri waiting for him on the second night, which surprised him only slightly. His cousin had apparently volunteered, or been volunteered, to check in periodically under the excuse of family duty, though Isaac suspected the real motive had more to do with proving himself braver than his younger cousin in front of the household. Shuri arrived loud and confident, carrying a lantern of his own and a sword he clearly hadn't trained enough with yet, declaring that he'd come to make sure nothing unnatural was happening inside the ruin. Isaac looked at him for a long moment, then asked, with the flat patience of someone negotiating a business deal rather than a childhood dare, whether Shuri wanted to actually help or just get in the way. Shuri, stung by the bluntness, insisted he wanted to help. Isaac put him to work. The ancestral vault sat behind 3 separate seals, each one keyed to a specific ritual the family had layered on over successive generations, each meant to keep exactly this kind of curious descendant out. The outer seal responded to blood. The second responded to a specific old prayer few in the current generation still remembered by heart. The third, buried deepest, responded to nothing at all that either of them understood, an ancient lock keyed to a presence the current family line had never possessed. Isaac walked up to it anyway and pressed his palm flat against the stone. The seal recognized him immediately, not as an Ashua descendant, but as something older, something the vault's original architects had built the whole structure around containing. Stone groaned and shifted, and the final door swung open on hinges that hadn't moved in 70 years, revealing a chamber packed floor to ceiling with a century's worth of confiscated mana cores, sealed relics too dangerous for casual use, and portrait after portrait of stern-faced ancestors glaring down from frames coated in decades of dust. Shuri froze in the doorway, staring at the sheer volume of hoarded wealth glittering in lantern light. Isaac walked past him and started working. He used his cousin exactly the way he'd planned to from the start, directing Shuri to haul crates, to hold portraits steady, while Isaac checked behind their frames for hidden compartments. To serve, essentially, as a very confused and very overworked pack mule for the next several hours. Shuri complained the entire time, insisting this wasn't what he'd volunteered for, and did it anyway. Some old instinct telling him that arguing with his younger cousin in this particular moment wasn't worth the effort it would cost him. It took most of the night to work through the room properly. Isaac drained mana core after mana core, feeling the old, familiar hum of power settle back into channels that had spent 100 years running nearly empty. Some of the cores were ancient enough to have belonged to soldiers who'd fought against him directly during his Skeleton King days, and draining them felt, in some private corner of his mind he didn't examine too closely, a little like closing an old account. Near the back of the vault, behind a portrait of a woman with sharp eyes and an expression that seemed to follow him across the room no matter where he stood, he found what he'd actually come looking for. A small reliquary box, sealed with wards far older and far more deliberate than anything protecting the rest of the room, sat tucked into a shadowed alcove that Shuri, exhausted and half asleep on his feet by that point, walked right past without noticing. Isaac felt it the moment he got close, the unmistakable resonance of something that had once belonged to him, back when he still wore a body of bare bone instead of borrowed flesh. He opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in cloth gone brittle with age, sat a single skeletal finger bone, small enough to fit in a child's palm, radiating a low and patient hum of power that hadn't been touched by anyone in 100 years. Isaac stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't much, a finger, a fragment, but it was his, undeniably, unmistakably his, the first piece of his old self he'd found since waking up in this new one, and something in his chest, a chest that technically belonged to a 6-year-old boy, tightened in a way he hadn't expected. He closed his hand around it and didn't let go for the rest of the night. By the time Kobin came looking for them near dawn, worried he'd lost track of his charges for too long, Isaac and Shuri were both sitting near the vault entrance looking thoroughly exhausted, and the room behind them looked exactly as undisturbed as it had the day before, every portrait back on its hook, every crate resealed and stacked precisely where it started. Isaac had made sure of that personally. Whatever he took from that vault, he intended to keep quiet for as long as possible. Shuri, for his part, said nothing about the vault to anyone once they returned to the main estate, partly out of exhaustion. Partly, though he'd never have admitted it out loud, because some instinct told him it was safer not to. Gaul's month-long exile plan produced exactly nothing useful for him. Isaac returned from the annex a week early, calm, unmarked, and reporting nothing more dramatic than boredom and a healthy respect for dust. The council saw no evidence of the instability Gaul had promised, and his standing among the family elders took a quiet hit for having wasted everyone's time chasing a hunch that led nowhere. He seethed over it in private, certain he was missing something, unable to prove it. He had no idea that the boy he'd tried to expose had walked out of that ruin carrying a piece of the very legend the family had spent 70 years trying to bury, humming quietly in a pocket sewn into the lining of his coat. The finger bone became Isaac's most carefully guarded secret over the following months, hidden inside a small wooden box he kept beneath a loose floorboard in his room, drained of just enough power at a time to avoid drawing attention, never enough to risk exposing what it really was. He grew stronger by degrees nobody else could measure, his control over the strange dual nature of his power sharpening in ways that would have terrified the entire estate had anyone understood what they were actually looking at. Gaul kept watching. Gaul kept waiting. And somewhere in the capital, preparations were already underway for the next great trial the family's rising generation would soon be forced to face. A set of tests older than the Ashua line itself, designed specifically to separate true faith from hidden corruption. The Pentagon trials were coming, and Isaac intended to walk through every stage of them exactly as unbothered as he'd walked out of that ruin. The Pentagon trials convened once every decade, drawing every noble candidate old enough to compete from all 5 great houses into a single sprawling complex built specifically for the purpose. 5 stages, 5 virtues, 1 brutal ranking system that decided which children would rise into positions of real influence and which would spend their lives serving those who did. Selection, silence, unity, combat, slaughter. Every candidate who passed with a high enough score earned official priestly ordination, and with it, access to resources and training most families would kill for. Isaac, by then 11 years old and quietly stronger than anyone in his family suspected, walked into the selection stage without a shred of the nervousness the other candidates wore openly on their faces. The first test wasn't combat. It was patience, dressed up as ceremony. Candidates were led into a long stone corridor lined with locked gates, each one guarded by an ancient construct built to test the discipline of whoever approached it. The rules were simple enough to sound easy, and hard enough to break most candidates within the first hour. Wait. Don't force the gate. Don't provoke the guardian. Let the trial recognize your patience on its own schedule. Most of the noble children shuffled forward and settled in to wait exactly as instructed, some fidgeting, some praying, all of them clearly uncomfortable with a challenge that offered no obvious way to prove themselves through effort. Isaac studied the gate in front of him for exactly as long as it took to recognize the make of the guardian sealed behind it. A rank 8 stone golem, old craftsmanship, the kind his own generals used to deploy as border sentries back when he commanded armies instead of classrooms. He knew its build. He knew, without needing to test it, exactly how much force it would take to put one down. He didn't wait. He gathered a crackle of dark lightning into one small fist, the same trick he'd once used to punch through enemy fortifications 100 years ago, and drove it straight into the gate's locking mechanism. The stone golem behind it didn't get a chance to fully activate. It cracked apart at the joints in one single echoing detonation, chunks of ancient rock scattering down the corridor, while the other candidates flinched back against the walls. Silence followed, the kind that comes right before someone decides whether to be furious or impressed. The trial's overseeing priest, a stern old exorcist named Father Corin who'd run this stage for 3 decades running, arrived at a fast walk to assess the damage and found an 11-year-old boy standing calmly in front of a demolished guardian construct that had taken his own predecessor's team a full week to build. "You were told to wait," Father Corin said. "I did wait," Isaac answered, entirely unbothered. "Long enough to recognize what I was looking at." It wasn't the answer Corin expected, and it wasn't, technically, against the rules as written. The trial demanded patience be recognized on its own schedule. Nobody had specified how long that schedule needed to run, or that recognizing the guardian's weakness didn't count as a valid form of patience in itself. Corin argued with two other overseeing priests for the better part of an hour before grudgingly awarding Isaac a passing score, on the technical grounds that the boy had, in fact, demonstrated more restraint waiting to identify the golem structure than most candidates showed waiting out the clock. Word of the destroyed Guardian spread through the other house's candidates before the day was even over. By the time the trials moved into their combat phase, Isaac had already earned himself a reputation he hadn't particularly gone looking for, and at least one rival determined to knock him back down before it grew any larger. Nigel Seffett came from the Crimson House, bred for combat the way racehorses were bred for speed, and he'd spent most of his short life being told he was the finest young talent his bloodline had produced in a generation. He didn't like sharing that spotlight any more than Shuri once had, and he liked it considerably less once whispers started comparing an 11-year-old exorcist candidate favorably against his own combat record. He made his move during the trial's maze stage, a sprawling underground labyrinth littered with traps designed to punish careless candidates and reward careful ones. Isaac had come prepared with a small ring, quietly looted from the annex vault months earlier, enchanted to reveal hidden pressure plates and ward triggers, a step before a candidate walked into them. Nigel's people lifted it off him during a crowded stretch of corridor, one of his vanguard cutting the ring's cord clean while pretending to bump into Isaac in passing. It was clumsy work, but effective enough, and Nigel's team moved ahead through the maze with newfound confidence, trusting a stolen ring to guide them safely through ground they hadn't earned the right to trust yet. Isaac noticed the ring was gone within seconds of losing it. He said nothing. He'd expected something like this from Nigel days ago, the kind of arrogant, predictable move a spoiled prodigy makes when he feels threatened, and he'd already planned around the possibility before it happened. The ring worked exactly as advertised. It revealed traps a step in advance. It said nothing, however, about what waited past the traps it revealed, and Isaac knew this particular stretch of maze better than Nigel's stolen ring ever could. Having quietly scouted its layout the night before using a small shadow scout none of the overseers had thought to ward against. He let Nigel's vanguard press confidently forward, guided by a ring that correctly steered them around every visible trap, straight into a hidden channel of banked fire elementals lying dormant beneath the corridor floor. An old defense mechanism the maze's original architects had built specifically to punish candidates who relied too heavily on borrowed tools instead of their own judgment. The fire erupted beneath Nigel's team in a wall of heat that sent them scrambling backward, robes singed, dignity thoroughly incinerated, along with several very expensive pieces of enchanted gear. Isaac walked past the wreckage a short while later, stepping over Nigel's charred vanguard where they'd collapsed against the corridor wall, using one particularly unfortunate soldier's flattened shield as a stepping stone to bypass a gap in the floor without breaking stride. Nigel, humiliated in front of every house watching the trial's public viewing screens, demanded an investigation into how his own stolen advantage had led his team into disaster. The investigation, once it actually happened, revealed exactly what everyone suspected. The ring had been stolen property to begin with, and using confiscated tools during an official trial carried its own separate penalty entirely apart from whatever damage the fire elementals had done. Nigel's punishment came down swift and humiliating. 18 hours a day scrubbing the trial complex's stone floors, a public sentence meant to strip some of the arrogance out of a boy who'd clearly needed it stripped for a while. He howled about the injustice of it to anyone who'd listen. Nobody listened very long. A crimson heir on his knees with a scrub brush made for excellent gossip among the other houses, and gossip, once it starts, rarely bothers checking whether its subject deserves the sympathy he's begging for. Isaac never mentioned that he'd let his ring get stolen on purpose. There didn't seem to be much point. The lesson had landed exactly the way he intended, and Nigel spent the remainder of the trials giving him a very wide, very resentful berth. The silence stage, technically meant to test a candidate's composure under provocation, produced its own small legend by the trial's end, though not the one the priests running it had originally planned for. Deep within the trial complex sat a stone testing hall few candidates ever entered without some private dread, home to statues carved centuries earlier depicting the Empire's greatest historical enemies, kept as monuments meant to remind young holy hunters exactly what their bloodlines had fought against. Tradition demanded every candidate kneel before these statues in a show of humility, acknowledging the cost their ancestors paid to defeat such monsters. The largest statue in that hall depicted a towering, robed figure wreathed in carved bone motifs, its stone face locked in an expression somewhere between judgment and contempt. Nobody in the current generation knew or had any reason to suspect exactly whose likeness the statue had been carved from. The plaque beneath it simply read, in old formal script, "The fallen tyrant, defeated by faith alone." Every candidate before Isaac had knelt in front of that statue without hesitation, some quickly, some with visible reluctance, all of them eventually bowing their heads the way tradition demanded. Isaac stood in front of it and refused. He wasn't entirely sure, standing there, whether it was some old and stubborn instinct from his skeleton king days rebelling at the idea of bowing to a monument built to celebrate his own supposed defeat, or something closer to simple curiosity about what would happen if he didn't. Either way, he stood with his chin up and his hands folded calmly behind his back, and he did not kneel. The overseeing priests bristled immediately. One stepped forward to correct him, already reaching to press a hand against his shoulder and force the boy down into the expected posture. The statue moved first. Stone cracked along old seams as the ancient figure's carved head tilted downward, fixing whatever passed for its attention squarely on the small boy refusing to bow before it. A low, grinding voice rolled out of it, ancient and resonant, carrying across the hall loud enough that every candidate and priest present heard it clearly. It declared, in words that echoed off stone walls built to test humility, that a soul which refused to kneel before a mere idol, while carrying true conviction inside itself, displayed a form of faith more genuine than any hollow ritual gesture ever could. The hall went dead silent. Nobody present had ever heard that statue speak before. Nobody present had any framework for understanding why it had chosen, of all candidates who'd passed through that hall over the centuries, to single out the one child who refused its tradition entirely and reward him for it instead of striking him down. Isaac didn't know either, not with any certainty, though some private, buried part of him suspected the old magic bound into that statue's construction recognized something in him that no living priest in that room could name. Recognition, maybe. Or perhaps simply a flicker of the same defiant spirit the statue itself had been carved to represent, responding instinctively to a kindred presence standing right in front of it. The priests, unable to argue with a centuries-old holy relic's direct verdict, had no choice but to record Isaac's refusal as an unprecedented pass. Whispers followed him out of that hall faster than the story of the shattered golem ever had. By evening, half the capital's noble houses had heard some version of the tale, most of them exaggerated well past what actually happened, all of them agreeing on the same central detail. A boy had refused to kneel before the Empire's most infamous defeated enemy, and the enemy's own monument had called it holy. Isaac walked out of the Pentagon trials that season ranked first among every candidate present, a full margin ahead of children who'd trained specifically for this moment their entire lives. Rely wept through the entire ceremony, insisting loudly to anyone nearby that he'd always known his nephew was destined for greatness. Eli watched the scores post with the same flat, calculating expression he wore over every successful investment, already recalculating exactly how much influence a first-ranked candidate might bring the family's name. Gaul stood near the back of the crowd, watching the ceremony with his jaw tight, and his suspicions no closer to proof than they'd been years earlier, growing more convinced with every fresh miracle that something about this boy simply didn't add up, and growing no closer to anyone willing to listen. Keena Barrett, the Gold House's own celebrated prodigy, watched the scores post with an entirely different reaction. She'd expected to rank first herself, had trained for exactly that outcome since she was old enough to hold a blessed weapon, and instead found herself staring at a name she barely recognized sitting comfortably above hers on the board. She decided, standing there with her pride bruised and her curiosity considerably more intact, that she intended to find out exactly what made this Ashua boy tick, whatever it cost her to learn it. Eli's next test came less than a month after the Pentagon ceremony ended, born from an old habit of pushing anything promising until it either broke or proved it couldn't. He arranged for Isaac to be sent into a warded elemental chamber deep beneath the estate, home to a king-tier fire spirit the family had captured generations earlier and never quite managed to fully subdue. The chamber's official purpose was binding practice, a controlled environment where promising exorcists tested their command over lesser elementals before graduating to something more dangerous. Nobody had attempted a binding on the king-tier spirit itself in decades. Eli wanted to see what an 11-year-old ranked first in his generation could actually do against something that outmatched full-grown priests. The fire spirit that greeted Isaac inside that chamber wasn't lesser anything. She rose out of a bed of banked coals in the shape of a woman wreathed in flame, ancient eyes narrowing the instant she registered a child standing where she expected another failed exorcist team. She didn't wait for pleasantries. A wave of heat rolled off her that cracked the chamber's outer stone lining, and Isaac felt, for the first time since waking up in this new body, something that actually threatened to overwhelm him if he wasn't careful. He didn't fight her the way the chamber's design expected. He reached instead for the same old trick that had carried him through every trial so far, letting his mana bend and twist mid-flow. Dark energy dressed up as something gentler on the way out, and used it to slip a set of hidden demonic shackles around her before she'd finished testing the limits of his defenses. She fought the binding hard. It took nearly everything he had to hold it in place once he'd started, and for a few tense seconds in that scorched chamber, it genuinely wasn't clear which one of them would come out ahead. She raged. She screamed threats in a language older than the Empire itself. She promised him a slow reckoning the moment the binding slipped. It didn't slip. Isaac locked her down, folding her rebellious fire into a containment loop meant to hold for 10 full years. Long enough for both of them, in their own strange way, to eventually reach an understanding neither expected going in. Eli declared the binding a triumph. Isaac walked out of that chamber quietly exhausted in a way none of his previous trials had managed, carrying inside him now not just his own reclaimed power, but a caged, furious ally who would spend the next decade learning, slowly, that this particular child wasn't the enemy she'd assumed. The years that followed moved the way years do when most of the important growth happens in private, away from anyone watching closely enough to understand what they're seeing. Isaac trained during the day the way the family expected, sparring, studying scripture, performing the small rituals a rising holy candidate was meant to perform. At night, in the quiet hours nobody bothered checking, he drained his old fingerbone by careful degrees, worked through the last of the annex vault's hoarded cores, and slowly rebuilt a foundation of power that had taken him a full lifetime to earn the first time around. By the time a decade had passed, the boy who'd once needed a stolen carriage ride home from a ruined nursery had grown into someone the household barely recognized as the same person, in more ways than the family understood. He packed what remained of his personal fortune into a single, unremarkable suitcase on a quiet morning nobody expected, walked past a half-asleep Shuri in the estate's main hall, and put his cousin flat on the floor with a single unbothered shove before the older boy even finished asking where he thought he was going. He left for the Royal Academy that same afternoon, officially enrolled under the family's blessing, privately relieved to finally step outside walls that had spent a decade watching him just a little too closely for comfort. The academy tested him in every way the family estate never quite managed to. Team trials against the Crimson House saw him dose his own squad with careful herbal doping before a physical match, turning ordinary teammates into snarling, overpowered berserkers who tore through their opponents before the referees fully understood what they were watching. A rigged elimination vote meant to strip him of his position saw him counter with fake elixirs made of nothing more than flour and a heavy dose of laxative, promised as a miracle antidote to teammates who'd already taken his real poison, forcing a unanimous vote in his favor from people too desperate for relief to ask too many questions. A demoness named Ash, sent to poison his squad on behalf of a rival faction, found herself brought to her knees the instant Isaac's crimson eyes flashed with a pressure she recognized on some old, buried level she couldn't explain. He forced her to turn on her own accomplice as proof of loyalty, then sent her back into the demon realm, not as a defeated enemy, but as a quiet informant loyal only to him. A foreign prince he found chained up during a solo hunt became, in Isaac's hands, less a rescue and more a bargaining chip, leveraged into stripping an entire company of mages down to their core crystals before anyone realized the hostage situation had been staged from the very beginning. By the time his public ordination ceremony arrived, the small boy who'd once fit into Reli's arms during a carriage ride home had grown, quite literally, into someone else entirely. He stepped onto that stage still wearing the shape of a child the crowd expected, and stepped off it moments later as a tall, striking young man, the last remnants of his infant form shed all at once in front of a temple full of witnesses who'd spent 10 years insisting he was destined for exactly this kind of miracle. Reli sobbed through the entire transformation, past even pretending it was allergies. Shuri stood frozen near the back, staring at a cousin who'd once used him as a human pack mule, now towering over half the room. The final piece of that ceremony asked every candidate to offer a drop of blood to the Holy Grail, an ancient artifact meant to confirm a soul's devotion by reflecting some image of divine favor back to the gathered witnesses. Isaac's blood hit the chalice, and the vessel turned entirely black. What rose out of it wasn't any gentle vision of holy light. It was a towering, terrible illusion of a skeleton king, exactly the shape carved into that testing hall statue years earlier, looming over the horrified cardinals in a silhouette none of them could mistake for anything but their empire's oldest nightmare given form again. Isaac didn't panic. He turned the panic into a tool instead, using the illusion's sheer terrifying presence as cover, a shield of dark spectacle that bought him precious seconds while the room's combined elemental strikes flew wide, aimed at a phantom instead of the boy actually standing in front of them. It should have ended his standing in that faith entirely. Instead, buried deep beneath the academy grounds in a high-security heretic wing, an old and mostly forgotten judgment altar was hauled out for exactly this kind of unresolved case, meant to test whether hidden corruption or true faith sat beneath a suspicious soul. What the altar actually sensed wasn't Isaac's own devotion at all. It was Shabnak's, the colossal demon elite, imprisoned decades earlier for refusing to betray his old king's memory even under torture, still carried inside him a loyalty untouched by 100 years of captivity. Some resonance of that loyalty reached the altar the instant Isaac stood before it, misread entirely by the priests overseeing the trial as evidence of a soul beloved by the divine, rather than a demon's unbroken devotion to his true master. The stone goddess statue overseeing that altar wept. Deep red tears, the kind reserved for the rarest confirmations of cardinal-level faith, ran down carved cheeks in front of a room full of stunned inquisitors who had absolutely no framework for understanding what they were actually witnessing. Isaac walked out of that hearing cleared of every heresy charge ever quietly whispered against him, his reputation, if anything, stronger than it had been before the Black Grail incident threatened to end it, which was how he came to stand, several weeks later, at the edge of a packed public coliseum, a Barrett prodigy, fighting for the honor of shading him from the sun with a leaf, a crimson heir he'd once humiliated, now serving as a mount he rode in on, both of them utterly unaware they were fighting over the right to serve the very thing their houses had spent 70 years training to destroy. The Coliseum's central ritual that day promised a public execution, a chained high-level demon general dragged out in front of the roaring crowd as proof of the Empire's continued dominance over the forces it warred against. Isaac had come, ostensibly, to witness it. Privately, he'd come with an entirely different plan already forming. The chains binding the demon general groaned, as the creature raised its head for the first time since being dragged into the arena's center, and the crowd's roar died into something closer to a collective gasp. Shabnak. An old subordinate, an old friend, in whatever strange, loyal way demons of his caliber were capable of friendship. A soldier who'd spent decades in a cell, rather than betray a single detail of the king he still, against every reasonable expectation, believed might one day come back for him. Isaac fixed his eyes on the massive, chained figure and felt something in his chest tighten the same way it had the night he first held his old finger bone in a dusty vault. A tracking ribbon, small and unremarkable, sat clutched in his hand, the last piece he needed to guide the rescue he'd spent years quietly preparing for. Shabnak unleashed a wave of dark energy across the arena floor, tearing space itself along its edges, and the crowd scattered screaming toward the exits, as inquisitors scrambled to contain a threat they had no idea was seconds away from being freed rather than destroyed. Isaac stepped forward, tracking ribbon tight in his fist, eyes locked on the old ally who had no idea rescue was already standing this close.